a functioning European Defence Union. Are you listening, Nick Clegg? It means a European army, navy and air force. They're already establishing their own command centre in Brussels. They've got, as he said, the fund, the money, the structures set up for all of it. And already they're divvying up which country will do the helicopter work, which country will be the major naval provider. All of that is happening right now. And it's very interesting, isn't it? When you're told by people that the Leave camp lied in the referendum because of some numbers on the side of a bust that may have been slightly overinflated. Compare that with the lies we've had for half a century from Nick Clegg and the others. A European army is happening. And you know something? I sat there in September, bearing in mind I have seat number 20 in Strasbourg in the European Parliament, and my friend Jean-Claude Juncker is seat number 21, so I was the closest elected politician in Europe to him when he gave that speech. And I thought to myself, thank goodness we're leaving, because we're not going to be part of these European military structures anymore. Well, so I thought. But some new, and I think very disturbing, evidence has come to light. It has not received any attention in British media at all, and yet, on next Monday, the Foreign Council of the European Union is going to be presented with a letter. The letter will ask people there to decide whether to agree on joint defence decision-making across the European Union. I'm wondering, given we're on the verge of that happening, whether the United Kingdom may or may not be part of that.
In a debate like this, the UK's future in Europe, how significant an influence would these publications still have? Paul, let's start with you.
Well, I think, actually, that when it comes to Britain's press, you're right. We read more newspapers than many other countries in the world. We're obsessive newspaper readers. You'll see people on the tube reading the free newspaper. You'll see people buying one every day. And obviously online, people read newspapers like the Huffington Post. So there's a great thirst for journalism in Britain. And I have to say that British press reflect the sort of debate that's going on within Britain right now, which is all about Europe. Do we want to stay or do we want to go? And many of the newspapers you'll have seen just there are very much in favour of Britain pulling out of the European Union. For years they reflect this debate in the Conservative Party that actually Britain would be better off out because we're sick of going down a route towards an ever-federal, a more closer union within Europe. The fact that maybe Europe wants to be a United States of Europe, like the United States of America, and a lot of people in Britain don't like that. However, when push comes to shove, Number 10 Downing Street are pretty sure that a lot of these newspapers, including the tabloids, may well back off that final decision of pulling out. In other words, they'll flirt with the idea of Brexit. They like the idea of keeping up pressure on Brussels, but when push comes to shove, maybe we're better off in.
So, Douglas, you just heard Paul there. The papers, the tabloids are all pushing this idea of getting out. What do you think? Do you think it'll have a major influence?
Well, I mean, much like American politics, we're used in Britain to very big issues about our nation's future being reduced to rivalries, individual dynasties, and so on. And that's what's happening in the last 48 hours with the so-called Brexit campaign. It's true what Paul says to a certain extent. I mean, a lot of the media here are very sceptical about the EU and always have been. That's because so many of their readers are very sceptical about the EU and always have been. But the important thing, in a way, is not to overstate the role of the media in this, because the in campaign, the campaign to keep Britain within the EU, which the Prime Minister is obviously part of, and almost the entire Labour Party, the opposition, among others, are part of, is in most ways the one that is currently going to outgun the out campaign. I say that because there's a massive campaign already underway from the city, from financial services, from a whole establishment to terrify the British people into voting to stay in the European Union, terrifying them into thinking that if they leave, all four horsemen of the apocalypse will immediately descend on the UK. So the British press is, to a great extent, just speaking back to that great project fear.
Douglas, I want to push further on that. You know, the Daily Express, that is a paper that's had a firm position on Europe for many years. They've been running what they call a crusade to get out of Europe. Do you expect other newspapers to, in effect, take a side on this issue, and where are they likely to come down?
Well, the Express is not surprising. It's running a sort of crusade. It has always had at the top right-hand corner of the front page a crusader on it. So that's the sort of thing the Daily Express would do. I'd expect, as Paul says, that a lot of them will flirt effectively with exit until the last minute. There will be some who will urge their readers to vote to get out of the European Union. Others will, I suspect, by that point, after a pretty bruising campaign, take a sort of moderate middle ground, and they will say that it would be the moderate middle ground choice to remain in the EU. But that itself is not a certainty, because although David Cameron and the Project Fear and the Remain lobby are trying to persuade the British people that exit from the European Union would be a leap into the dark and into the unknown, actually remaining in the EU at this stage, after seeing all of the recent crashes that the EU has gone through, may itself be deemed by the British people to be a far greater leap in the dark. In other words, that Remain may be more dangerous for us than exit.
Interesting. Paul, I want to pose this question to you, given that you are with the Huffington Post UK. Has the power to form opinion, has it moved away from traditional newspapers in recent years? Has it moved more toward online discourse? Or does that now play out in social media? What do you think?
Well, newspapers have caught up. There used to be dinosaurs when it came to new media and online. Lots of British newspapers have rapidly learned that they've got to be on Facebook, they've got to be on Twitter. I was one of the first journalists in the House of Commons lobby to be on Twitter. At the time, people said, what on earth are you doing that for? That was back in 2009. Now everybody's on it. The big difference here is that this is not just a story about politics or economics. It does involve personalities. It does involve trusting people you know to be on the same side. That's why Boris matters in this race. You open the segment with Boris. He's called the politician, the kind of Heineken politician here. He refreshes the parts that other politicians can't reach in Britain. He's got a popular appeal on the street with plumbers, with plasterers, with van drivers, unlike many politicians here. And that's why David Cameron was so worried about him making that decision last night. And so it's not just the newspapers and the media, it's people like Boris who could help sway this debate. There's one poll last week that showed Boris could add 15 points to the out campaign. That's some marks.
But it starts from a perfectly reasonable instinct. It's interesting to have a diversity of a kind. Now the question is, of course, when does it become uninteresting? When does it stop repaying the interest you're taking on it? And when does the diversity become undiverse? The first 100 people from Pakistan bring a certain amount of cultural interest. Do the next 1,000 and the next million and the next 4 million and the next 10 million? When is the point when you've kind of got enough of what you need to know and learn and to experience? And these are very unpleasant in a way discussions to have, but they are the one that we're living through in a way. And our unwillingness to even address it is a big part of the problem, only made worse by the fact that this isn't a science. It's not like you could work out on a chart, the point at which you become uninterested in something or think you've had enough of it. But this is what we're all living through, and so we ought to be able to talk about it.
Well, and I think that your earlier point, Douglas, about the welfare state is something well worth for people to dwell on, because a lot of times people say, well, America was a nation of immigrants. And I've even heard that England is a nation of immigrants, which I grew up in England, and I just find the idea you really, really have to stretch history beyond the breaking point to make that kind of case.
Fortunately, of course, there are loads of people who are willing to stretch history beyond breaking point. And they always say yes, there's a plausible, explanation of America as a nation of immigrants. There is a totally implausible claim about Britain where, the Norman conquest was the biggest event in the last millennium in Britain, and it changed the population by about 5%. That was an invasion of Britain. Really, in the last couple of millennium, really what you're talking about in terms of immigration to Britain is some people from Ireland moving over to the mainland of Britain and vice versa. And, 50,000 French Protestants came in the 17th century. And that pretty much, that's pretty much the only movement we're talking about of any meaning. So it just isn't the case, albeit there are masses of people who want to argue the line. It just isn't the case. We had huge movements from sub-Saharan Africa throughout the 15th century into the UK. It just didn't happen.
And in America, of course, and this was specifically by design for the immigration policy, the vast majority of immigrants were from Western Europe. A lot of them were Protestants. They were white, of course, similar backgrounds, similar histories. But most importantly, without the honeypot of the welfare state, it was fairly safe to assume that people who moved to America in, say, the 18th and 19th centuries moved to America because they valued the American system in some manner. It gave them freedom, it gave them land, it gave them opportunity. And so they moved there because they weren't bribed to be there. It's the difference between dating and hiring a prostitute. If you hire a prostitute, is she there for you or is she there for the money? And this comes, and I know that's a harsh way to characterize immigrants. It really is an analogy. But if people are coming to England because they value the British frame of mind, the British way of life, British liberties, British philosophy, and so on, I say the more the merrier. If, however, there's this giant payout called the welfare state, are people coming there because they value British values, or because they can make 10 times, I know that in Europe, they can make 10 times on the welfare state what they could make in their home country. So are they there for the values, or are they there for the money? If they're there for the money, this seems to me a significant powder keg, because statistically, the money can't continue.